Hello, everybody, and welcome back to You Exchange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world, spanning across Europe, the USA, Africa, and India. This has allowed me to deliver actionable insights that have improved user experiences with nutrition, automotive, delivery, and e commerce sectors. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research, specifically focusing on UX research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. Happy to be back, and today I will be covering a topic that is very dear to me because it has to do with measuring the unconscious. And when it comes to our use of technology or use of products and so on and so forth. So, as you might already remember, if you're a fellow listener of the podcast, I have a background in neuroscience. To be fair and clear, I'm not a professional neuroscientist working every day in a lab. But I have some background in neuroscience. I did some studies in that area, including, for instance, topics such as cognitive neuroscience, emotions, perception, sensations, and so on and so forth. And with all that came all the skills that are required to be a user experience researcher, including how to craft questions, how to create a survey, how to analyze the answers from a large pool of respondents, and so on and so forth. But really at the root of it, and this is what I really loved, was the topic of perception, cognitive science, and how do we integrate our senses and how do we create a final image that is our perception. This is a very deep topic that I really love it. But this is not the exact focus of today. Today we will be talking about how can you explore as a researcher, but not only in your day-to-day activity, in your day-to-day, how can you, let's say, dig a little bit deeper with yourself or when you talk to someone when it comes to dimensions that are not necessarily conscious. So I'm currently reading a book from Carl Jung, and I became really interested with this notion that Jung is stating in his book. I'm gonna butcher it, and I'm sorry in advance, but I think at some point of the book he says something like, "We spend more than half of our lives in an unconscious state," and then he goes on and on to explain why the unconscious is so important to our day-to-day life. It is important. We don't have access to it, at least not so easily, but it is important. And then he goes on saying that it's not necessarily negative because it's part of us, and there is always a dichotomy between conscious and unconscious, unconscious being negative, conscious being, let's say, not complete, and so on. Yes, there are a lot of associated notions with that. I'm not a psychoanalyst and I'm not a psychologist, but I can recognize that a huge part of our day-to-day and our lives is unconscious. A best example of that is the dream. The dream is able to surface to us things that are not accessible in a day-to-day. Anyways, so all of that to say that unconscious state is really important, and this is what I believe holds, what can I say, a lot of dimensions that are important to the user experience, such as deep needs when using a technology. dreams, fears, concerns, and so on. So it seems logical to say it like that, but to some people it might not seem so logical. But let me give you one example. How many times have you said something that you have not done? How many times were you saying something to someone that you were going to do something and you ended up not doing it? Or how many times were you saying something retrospectively, describing something from the past that in the end you had not done? For instance, oh, but I'm fairly active, says the person who doesn't do cardio any day in the week, and myself included sometimes. My point is, we are sometimes not so good at saying the truth. And I'm not saying we do this on purpose. I'm saying there are several dimensions to our expression and to our state. So we have what we say, we have what we do. So this is really easy to conceptualize. We can act in this world and we can speak in this world. But before acting and before speaking, there are a chain of events. What do we do? Why do we do what we do? We do it because we are motivated to do it. And these motivations are, at the root of these motivations, we have some needs. The needs propels motivation, which propels to act. And then based on that, we will reflect. And our actions are sometimes accessible in our conscience, and sometimes they are not. So let me give you an example. When you're hungry, you go eat. It's simple. If you're not so hungry, you can maybe choose something more healthy. You can make choices, informed decisions. But the more you're hungry, the hungrier you are, the less you will be able to have a rational control on your decision. So in the end, you will be much more driven by your basic instincts. And so that's an example of the fact that even our most basic behaviors, sometimes we don't even notice why we are doing what we are doing. So if you're in a depressed or anxious state, you might eat more calories, for instance, to compensate. That's an example, of course. Or we can be, in a certain situation that reminds us of an impactful memory, and so we are kind of, how can I say, shaken by this, and we cannot explain. Anyway, so my point being that sometimes we say things, but they do not necessarily match what we are doing. An example that is much more applied to user experience. How many times have I evaluated an interface with users, asking them, what do you feel about this interface? They would tell me, oh, it's very easy to use. And then when you analyze their path, the way they use the technology, it was full of errors. We would call it errors. It's not their errors, of course. If you are long-time listeners of the podcast, you know that the UI is always at the root. So they would make errors. They would go back and forth when using it. They would spend a lot of time looking for where they should click. And so in the end, they would say, yeah, it's easy. It doesn't necessarily match the struggle they have been facing. So I hope that by now it's clear that there is sometimes a gap between what people say and what people do. And so first and foremost, it's really important to have a holistic viewpoint. I would say a holistic cohesive picture of what we are trying to research. So if I want to understand how someone is experiencing a product, well, you need not only to observe them, you need also to ask them. And you cannot only ask them, you should also observe them. For instance, let me give you an example. Some Apple phones fans would tell you, yeah, this is the best iOS ever, the latest iOS that you can download. And in parallel, you would see them struggling with the new interface design, as an example. So I hope I made my point across for now. Anyways, so a way for you to get closer to the truth, because observing someone will give you half of the story. Because if you just observe and take notes, you will not have all the perceptions that are linked to that. For instance, if you see someone clicking, imagine you want someone to you want to observe when someone is purchasing something on an e-commerce website. And you see that, well, this is required to sign up, but they don't do it. Or they are looking to go back. Well, this is an observation, right? They land on this page and they didn't sign up and they went back. If you stop there, you don't know why. That's the thing. Observing someone doing something is good to tell you the what. What is happening? Like, it's the most raw and, how can I say, genuine piece of information. It's what is happening right now in this very moment, unaltered. But it doesn't mean that this is the absolute truth. What is the truth? The truth in this case depends on what you're looking for. But in this case, if you want to research the experience of something, you need to understand, you need to observe what's happening, but you also need to understand how people are experiencing it. Because in the end, this is part of the whole story, right? So you would observe this person interacting with this product, and then you would ask them, why did you go back? What made you go back? And they would tell you, well, I had to sign up on websites because then I never remember about my passwords, and then I have 1 million passwords, and so on and so forth. So then you have a complete picture. You would be able to tell anyone that is designing, you would tell them, look, I think it would be great to add a guest mode because our users generally say that they don't want to create an account to purchase. Then, of course, you have 1 million more considerations to have in mind, like business. Maybe at the business level, it's very interesting to have people signing up because we can track them, we can send personalized ads to them, and maybe altogether that increases the likelihood of people coming back to purchase. But all in all, what I mean is that you need to ask and to observe to get a picture of what people experience. And even though the point I want to make in this episode is that it's still not enough. Why is it not enough? Because, again, if you give a product to someone, let's say a smartphone, people will only use it to the extent of what they have. It's like the most logical thing ever. They cannot... Well, yeah, you can play soccer with your phone if you want, as the ball. Yeah, you could. But my point is, you cannot completely have a usage of the product that is as if it was not this product. You cannot. Like, you're giving something to someone to use, they will use what they have in the way they see fit, but they would use what they have. And then it's the same. What they are saying, people are very bad at rationalizing and explaining what they think, feel, do, and so on and so forth. We know that as a fact. And that's why there is all this methodology of inquiry. That's why the psychology is a field of study, and so on and so forth. And that's why there are some great methodologies. For instance, the 5 whys. You ask someone why they're doing what they're doing, and you repeat the question 5 times. And you get to the root of deeper needs. So that's one thing. But then my point today is asking someone what they feel, think, experience is one thing. Observing them is another thing. Having them in combination is great. My last point is if you want to get to the root of what people experience, of what people are afraid of what people are concerned about, what do they envision for the future, one great way of doing so, and it's not by me, this has been described for years in the literature. One good book is Convivial Toolbox, explaining that, is to observe people making stuff. So you give them ingredients, you give them tools with a set of instructions, and you observe them making stuff. So in user experience, this is oftentimes referred to as co-design, co-creation, participatory design, generative research, and so on and so forth. Why is it called this way? Because you generate new artifacts, products, and tools, and at the same time, you are researching on that. So let me give you an example. If I'm a company and I'm building a chatbot, and I want to make sure I'm building the chatbot in the right direction. Of course, you'll tell me, if you're a long-time listener of the podcast, you would first make sure you're understanding users' needs. What is the problem? You will ideate on top of the problem, and you will define a solution, and then you will evaluate the solution. That's one way to do it. That's one way. Another way, a better way to do it is to have participants, and sorry here for the redundancy, participate in the product design process. It's as simple as that. For many reasons, it makes a lot of sense. The only reason it would not make so much sense is it adds efforts for you to create the activities, the workshops, and then it adds a little bit more of effort to you to analyze. That is if you are the only designer or researcher in the team in charge of doing that, because the effort that is added to you, and I agree this, if you would say so to me, I would agree with you. The effort that is added on your plate is nothing compared to the time you're saving for the company, because you avoid so much back and forth, design, evaluation. You get closer to what people want directly in a workshop. So that's why it's so powerful. And then I'm going to address the rest of the topics in subsequent episodes. But my point being that if you give people the space to create, you will discover a whole new set of dimensions and opportunities. So one good example, as I was saying, is the chatbot. How should we design our chatbot? Well, we could understand users' needs, design it with ideation, but then we are the ones ideating. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does, probably, because then we evaluate, but maybe we should also sneak in some users at the design and the creation process. Maybe, just saying. Because if you do that, they are speaking in words that are not everyday words. That's the point. You are giving them a whole new set of vocabulary and tools and expressions to communicate their needs, feelings, and desires. There is one limitation to that, is that it is limited to the ingredients and the tools you will give your users. So imagine, if I ask my users, what is your ideal agent? I can proceed through several steps. The first step is, okay, what is the role of the agent? What should be the role? Should it be a counselor? Should it be an assistant? Should it be a butler? Should it be a companion? Should it be a friend? Should it be a mom? That's one role. But how should you determine that? Maybe there are way more roles than that. So you could probably give some tags to your users, or some cards. There would be role cards. And so you tell your users, choose among these roles. You can blend them together if you want. You can create several roles. Or you can put them in the days of the week, for instance. You can also say, you can create your own roles. Or instead of speaking of roles, you can ask them, what are the skills of your agents? What are the skills? And so they would tell you, oh, well, my agent is capable of learning my name. My agent is capable to see that I'm his friend after some time. So that's one example. And then you can say, oh, yeah, when your agent is wrong, help us understand how would that go? Oh, yeah, well, you have an axis here from 0 to the end of the day, let's say, 0 to the end of the interaction, and at the very beginning, he's being very coherent and so on, but at some point, he's being wrong. What is happening? What is the agent saying to you? How is that displayed? And how can you give it feedback? Oh, well, I imagine I'm giving feedback here and there and here and there and so on. So you get the point. It's like, it's a whole new vocabulary, and you're bridging the gap between what users are thinking but not able to verbalize, because you provide them the tools to verbalize, because you are providing the user the same language as you. Be careful with that though, because the risk is to bias your user and to use technical jargon and so on and so forth. So be careful. There's a good trade-off to have, of course. But my point being is, if you respect both the good practices of interviewing users and the good practices of creating workshops for users, you will be unstoppable, because you will create a new language for your users to interact with, for your users to be able to interact with you. That's one thing. Another aspect for which I am really, really a fan of workshops and co-creation sessions and so on is merely the fact that when you ask a question to a user, it has a certain, I don't know, maybe it has been described in literature. I have no idea. I'd love it to be described, and if anyone has a reference for that, please let me know. But when you ask a question and when you give an answer, it has a certain amount of information per amount of words. So if I am someone that is very impactful in my talk and in my speech, I am able to carry way more information in way less amount of words than someone that is not. I hope that you get the point. And the thing is, well, I'm sure there were some studies, for instance, cross languages and so on, to compare. I'm sure, like the English language carries more information in one sentence, whatever, than the French language. I'm sure that there were some studies on that. Anyways, and I would be really, really, how can I say? I would have a strong hypothesis saying that, especially in use cases such as design thinking and creating workshops and having people communicate their expectations and their needs in a workshop, using the workshop language instead of asking questions back and forth is way more efficient in terms of the amount of information you gather per second or per artifact. Just imagine that. You put on a board, so it could be a physical or a digital board, you put cards, you put names, you put colors, you put shapes, and so on. And out of all that, you have your user who is talking to you, who is interacting with the artifacts, and who is ultimately building something. That is in itself some data. And so that is really, really interesting, because you're not using words, you're not asking questions. Well, you are kind of, but not only. And so that's why it's so powerful, because it's a condensation of meaning with way less effort on both parties. And so there is no reason, to my mind, for not doing that. If you want to create products, just involve your users in your process. Of course, the downside to that is you will be way more tempted to just follow what they ask. Don't do that either. Use that as data, and then Designers are the ultimate, product teams are the ultimate decision makers on how to proceed because they have information that users don't, which is business information. And I may, how can I say, I may spark some revolts here, some comments, but ultimately users are not the business. Like users, I hope it will not be taken out of context, but users are at the base of the business. Of course, without users, you don't have a business or customers, but ultimately they are one dimension of it. You also need to be profitable. You also need to, you need to consider competitors as an example, and that is not an information from the users. They don't know everything. So even if they tell you, well, I need a green button, well, whatever. Okay, maybe. You know what I mean? So probably have that in mind. Include your users in the process. It's even one more dimension. It's really beneficial on all fronts. So thank you for listening. I hope you like this one, and I hope to see you in the next one. Cheers. Yo.